Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates painted their nails and talked about boys, she spent her afternoons at the local shooting range with her grandfather, a former Marine who taught her that precision was everything. Her hands were steady, her eye was sharp, and her heart beat with the rhythm of controlled breathing and perfect aim. At 17, Sarah was already breaking records at regional competitions. Her bedroom walls were covered with ribbons and trophies, each one representing hours of practice and dedication. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and concern as their daughter pursued what they considered an unusual hobby for a young woman. But Sarah didn't care about their worries. She had found her calling, and nothing could shake her confidence. The state championship was only 3 weeks away when everything changed. Sarah had been practicing for months, fine-tuning her technique, and preparing for the biggest competition of her young career. She had even received interest from several college scouts who promised full scholarships if she could maintain her performance level. The future seemed bright and full of possibilities. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at the range early, before the crowds and the noise. She preferred the quiet hours when she could focus completely on her breathing and her stance. Her grandfather's old rifle felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of herself. She had cleaned and maintained it the night before, as she did every night, treating the weapon with the respect it deserved. The first few shots went perfectly. The targets fell with satisfying precision, each bullet finding its mark exactly where Sarah intended. She felt the familiar rush of satisfaction that came with perfect execution. Her confidence was building, and she could almost taste the victory that awaited her at the state championship. But on her 15th shot of the day, something went terribly wrong. The rifle made an unusual sound, a sharp crack that was different from the normal report. Sarah felt something give way in the mechanism, and suddenly, her grandfather's beloved rifle was damaged beyond what she could repair on the spot. The firing pin had snapped, and without it, the rifle was nothing more than an expensive piece of metal. Sarah stared at the broken weapon in disbelief. This rifle had been her grandfather's companion through 2 tours of duty and had never failed him once. It had been her trusted partner through countless competitions and practice sessions. Now, with the most important competition of her life just weeks away, it lay useless in her trembling hands. The range master, Mr. Rodriguez, examined the rifle with the expertise of someone who had seen every kind of mechanical failure imaginable. He shook his head slowly, his weathered face showing genuine sympathy for the young shooter. The firing pin was completely shattered, and the part would need to be specially ordered. Even if they could find the right component, it would take at least a month to arrive, maybe longer. Sarah felt her world crumbling around her. Without her rifle, she couldn't practice. Without practice, she couldn't compete. Without competing, she couldn't win the scholarships that would secure her future. All of her dreams seemed to be slipping away because of one broken piece of metal no bigger than her thumb. Her parents tried to be supportive when she came home that evening, her eyes red from crying and her usual confidence nowhere to be found. They suggested she could borrow a rifle from the range or perhaps buy a new one. But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Every rifle was different, with its own personality and quirks. She had spent years learning to work with her grandfather's rifle, understanding its tendencies and adjusting her technique accordingly. The shooting community in their small town was tight-knit, and word of Sarah's predicament spread quickly. Several experienced shooters offered to lend her their weapons, but each attempt at practice ended in frustration. The borrowed rifles felt foreign in her hands, their balance and trigger pull completely different from what she was accustomed to. Her shots scattered wildly across the targets, missing by margins that would have been unthinkable just days before. Coach Williams, who had been training Sarah for the state championship, watched her struggles with growing concern. He had seen promising young athletes derailed by equipment failures before, but Sarah's case was particularly heartbreaking. She had been shooting better than ever in the weeks leading up to the mechanical failure, and he had genuinely believed she could take the state title. As the days passed, Sarah's confidence continued to erode. She would arrive at the range with determination, only to leave in disappointment after another session of poor shooting with unfamiliar equipment. The other competitors at the range began to whisper among themselves, some expressing sympathy, while others seemed relieved that their strongest opponent was struggling. The local gun shop owner, elderly Mr. Peterson, took a particular interest in Sarah's situation. He had been in the business for 40 years and had seen his share of heartbroken young athletes. When Sarah's father approached him about purchasing a new rifle, Mr. Peterson quoted a price that made the family's financial situation painfully clear. A quality competition rifle cost more than the Martinez family could afford, especially on such short notice. Sarah's grandfather had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind only memories and the rifle that now sat broken and useless in their gun safe. She remembered his stories about maintaining his weapons in impossible conditions during his military service, using whatever materials he could find to keep his rifle functioning when lives depended on it. Those stories seemed like fantasy now, faced with the reality of modern precision equipment that required exact specifications and professional manufacturing. The championship was now only 2 weeks away, and Sarah had all but given up hope. She still went to the range, but more out of habit than any real expectation of improvement. Her borrowed rifle shots remained inconsistent, and her frustration was visible to everyone around her. Coach Williams suggested she consider sitting out this year's competition and focusing on preparing for next season, but the suggestion felt like admitting defeat. Local newspaper reporter Janet Collins had been following Sarah's story, planning to write a feature about the young shooting prodigy's quest for the state title. Instead, she found herself documenting the dreams of a talented athlete being crushed by circumstances beyond her control. The story she was writing had taken an unexpected and heartbreaking turn. Sarah's younger brother Miguel watched his sister's transformation from confident competitor to dejected teenager with confusion and sadness. He had always looked up to Sarah's dedication and skill, and seeing her so defeated made him question whether pursuing excellence was worth the risk of such devastating disappointment. The entire family felt the weight of Sarah's broken dreams. The final blow came when Sarah received a letter from one of the college scouts who had been interested in her performance. The scout explained that they would be attending the state championship to make final scholarship decisions, and that this competition would be crucial for any student hoping to earn their support. Without being able to compete at her usual level, Sarah knew she was effectively eliminating herself from consideration. That evening, Sarah sat in her room surrounded by trophies and ribbons that now seemed like reminders of a past she could never reclaim. Her grandfather's rifle lay disassembled on her desk, its broken firing pin representing everything that had gone wrong in her carefully planned life. She had always believed that hard work and dedication were enough to overcome any obstacle, but now she faced a problem that couldn't be solved through practice or determination. The championship was 13 days away, and Sarah Martinez was further from her goals than she had ever been. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Martinez household. Sarah's high school shop teacher, Mr. Thompson, stood at their front door with a toolbox in one hand and a determined expression on his weathered face. He had heard about Sarah's situation through the local grapevine and couldn't stand the thought of such talent being wasted over a mechanical problem. Mr. Thompson had spent 30 years teaching students to work with their hands, turning raw materials into functional objects through patience, skill, and creativity. He had served in the Navy before becoming an educator, where he learned that sometimes the difference between success and failure came down to improvising solutions when proper parts weren't available. Sarah's mother invited him in, though Sarah herself remained skeptical when she saw him examining the broken rifle. She had already heard from several well-meaning adults who thought they could help, only to discover that competition-grade firearms required precision that casual tinkering couldn't provide. The firing pin wasn't just any piece of metal. It was a precisely engineered component that had to meet exact specifications to function safely and accurately. Mr. Thompson carefully studied the broken firing pin under a magnifying glass, measuring its dimensions and examining the fracture pattern. He asked Sarah detailed questions about how the failure had occurred, what the rifle had felt like in the moments before the break, and how it had performed in the days leading up to the incident. His questions were technical and specific, showing a level of understanding that surprised both Sarah and her parents. After an hour of examination, Mr. Thompson sat back and delivered his assessment. The firing pin had failed due to metal fatigue, probably caused by decades of use and thousands of firing cycles. The break was clean, which meant that if they could create a replacement part with the same specifications, the rifle should function exactly as it had before. The challenge was manufacturing that replacement part with the precision required for competitive shooting. Sarah listened to his explanation with a mixture of hope and doubt. She wanted to believe that her rifle could be saved, but she also understood the reality of precision manufacturing. Competition rifles were built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and even small variations could affect accuracy dramatically. How could a high school shop class possibly produce components that met such demanding standards? Mr. Thompson seemed to read her thoughts and smiled with the confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before. He explained that modern high school machine shops were equipped with computer-controlled tools that could produce parts with precision that would have amazed craftsmen of previous generations. The real question wasn't whether they could make the part, but whether they could make it correctly on the first try with limited time and resources. That afternoon, Sarah found herself in the school's machine shop for the first time in her life. The space was filled with equipment she had never paid attention to before: lathes, mills, grinders, and computer-controlled machines that hummed with quiet precision. Mr. Thompson introduced her to several of his advanced students who had volunteered to help with the project. The team included Marcus, a senior who planned to study mechanical engineering and had already been accepted to several prestigious programs. There was also Elena, whose father owned a machine shop and who had been working with precision tools since middle school. The third volunteer was James, a quiet junior who spent his free time restoring vintage motorcycles and had an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems functioned. Mr. Thompson explained that creating the new firing pin would require several steps, each demanding absolute precision. First, they would need to select the proper steel alloy, one that could withstand the repeated impact and stress of firing while maintaining its shape and strength. Then, they would need to machine the part to exact specifications, heat-treat it to achieve the proper hardness, and, finally, test it to ensure it would function safely. The selection of materials proved to be the first major challenge. Competition firing pins were typically made from tool steel that had been specially treated to achieve specific properties of hardness and durability. Mr. Thompson contacted several suppliers, explaining the situation and the urgent timeline. Most were unable to help, but, finally, a specialty steel supplier in Dallas agreed to overnight a small piece of appropriate material at no charge after hearing about Sarah's story. While they waited for the steel to arrive, the team spent time studying the broken firing pin and creating detailed technical drawings. Using precision measuring instruments, they documented every dimension, angle, and curve of the original part. Elena proved particularly skilled at this work, her experience in her father's shop evident in her careful attention to detail and her understanding of manufacturing tolerances. Marcus took charge of programming the computer-controlled lathe that would shape the basic form of the new firing pin. The machine was capable of incredible precision, but only if programmed correctly. Every measurement had to be exact, and every tool path had to be calculated to account for the properties of the steel and the cutting forces involved. A single error in programming could ruin the part and force them to start over with no time for mistakes. James focused on the heat treatment process that would give the finished part the hardness and strength it needed to function reliably. This step was crucial because a firing pin that was too soft would deform under use, while one that was too hard would be brittle and likely to break. The heat treatment had to be precisely controlled, with exact temperatures and cooling rates that would produce the desired metallurgical properties. Sarah watched the team work with growing amazement and gratitude. These students were volunteering their time and skills to help someone they barely knew, simply because they believed in the importance of her dreams. Mr. Thompson supervised every step, offering guidance and ensuring that safety procedures were followed, but the students were doing the actual work with impressive competence and dedication. The steel arrived the next morning, and the team immediately began the machining process. The computer-controlled lathe worked with hypnotic precision, removing tiny amounts of material with each pass and gradually shaping the rough steel bar into something that resembled a firing pin. The work was slow and methodical, with frequent measurements to ensure that every dimension remained within acceptable tolerances. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched the machine work. Each cut brought them closer to having a replacement part, but also closer to discovering whether their efforts would succeed or fail. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. If any dimension was wrong, the firing pin might not fit properly, might not function reliably, or might even be dangerous to use. After 6 hours of machining, the basic shape was complete. The new firing pin looked identical to the original, but appearances could be deceiving. The real test would come when they measured it against the specifications they had documented. Elena carefully checked each dimension with precision instruments, calling out measurements while Marcus recorded them on their worksheet. The news was encouraging, but not perfect. Most dimensions were within acceptable tolerances, but the tip of the firing pin was slightly oversized. This meant they needed to do additional machining to achieve the exact specifications required. The work would be delicate, removing only a few thousandths of an inch while maintaining the precise angles and surface finish that would ensure proper function. James suggested using hand tools for this final adjustment, arguing that the human touch could achieve the precision needed while minimizing the risk of removing too much material. Mr. Thompson agreed, and they spent the next 2 hours carefully filing and polishing the firing pin tip until it matched the original specifications exactly. The heat treatment process began that evening, with the team staying after school to monitor the furnace and ensure proper temperature control. The firing pin had to be heated to exactly the right temperature, held there for a specific amount of time, and then cooled according to a precise schedule. Any deviation from the process could compromise the strength and reliability of the finished part. As they waited for the heat treatment to complete, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of her sport had changed in just a few days. She had always focused on the skills of shooting itself, breathing, stance, sight alignment, and trigger control. Now she was learning about the incredible complexity of the equipment that made precision shooting possible, and the skill of the people who designed and manufactured that equipment. The heat treatment finished near midnight, but Mr. Thompson insisted they wait until morning to remove the firing pin from the furnace. The cooling process needed to proceed slowly and naturally, and any attempt to rush it could undo all their careful work. Sarah went home that night with more hope than she had felt in days, but also with the knowledge that the hardest test was still ahead. The next morning would reveal whether their efforts had succeeded in creating a functional replacement part, or whether Sarah's championship dreams would remain broken along with her grandfather's rifle. The firing pin looked perfect as it cooled in the furnace, but only testing would prove whether their improvised manufacturing process had created a component that could withstand the demands of competitive shooting. With 9 days remaining until the championship, Sarah was closer to a solution than she had been since her rifle first broke, but she was still far from certain that she would be able to compete at the level she needed to achieve her goals. The morning sun cast long shadows across the machine shop as Sarah arrived to find Mr. Thompson already examining the heat-treated firing pin under intense lighting. The part had cooled overnight, and its surface now showed the subtle color changes that indicated successful heat treatment. To the untrained eye, it looked identical to the original, but the real test would be whether it could function under the extreme conditions of competitive shooting. Mr. Thompson explained that they needed to conduct several tests before installing the firing pin in Sarah's rifle. First, they would check the hardness of the steel to ensure the heat treatment had achieved the proper metallurgical properties. Then, they would examine the part under magnification to look for any flaws or imperfections that might cause future failures. Only after these preliminary tests could they risk installing the part in the rifle itself. The hardness test required a specialized instrument that pressed a diamond-tipped indenter into the steel under controlled force, then measured the size of the resulting impression. The measurements would tell them whether the firing pin had achieved the proper balance of hardness and toughness. Too soft, and it would deform under use. Too hard, and it would be brittle and prone to breaking. Elena operated the hardness tester with the same careful attention to detail she had shown throughout the project. The first test produced a reading that was slightly lower than optimal, but still within the acceptable range for firing pin applications. A second test in a different location showed similar results, confirming that the heat treatment had been successful despite their improvised equipment and procedures. The microscopic examination revealed surface quality that impressed even Mr. Thompson, whose standards had been shaped by decades of precision manufacturing. The students had achieved surface finishes and dimensional accuracy that rivaled professional machine shop work. James's careful attention to the final polishing steps had produced a firing pin that looked like it had come from the original manufacturer. With the preliminary tests complete, the moment of truth had arrived. Sarah's rifle waited on the workbench, disassembled, and ready to receive its new firing pin. Mr. Thompson supervised as Sarah herself installed the part, explaining each step and ensuring that every component was properly aligned and secured. The process was surprisingly simple, taking only minutes to complete. The reassembled rifle felt familiar in Sarah's hands, its weight and balance exactly as she remembered. But the true test would come when she actually fired it, subjecting the new firing pin to the forces and stresses it was designed to handle. Mr. Thompson had arranged for them to use the school's indoor shooting range, normally reserved for the JROTC program, for initial testing. Safety was their primary concern during the first test firing. Mr. Thompson had researched cases of firing pin failures and knew that a poorly made or improperly installed part could cause dangerous malfunctions. They started with a single cartridge loaded in the rifle, with everyone except Sarah positioned well behind protective barriers. She would fire one shot, then carefully examine the rifle and firing pin for any signs of problems. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she aimed at the target just 25 yards away. This wasn't about accuracy. It was about whether her rifle would function at all. She controlled her breathing, aligned her sights, and gradually increased pressure on the trigger until the rifle fired with its familiar crack. The sound was exactly as she remembered, with none of the unusual noises that had preceded the original firing pin failure. The examination of the rifle after that first shot was thorough and methodical. Mr. Thompson removed the firing pin and studied it under magnification, looking for any signs of deformation, cracking, or unusual wear. The part appeared perfect, showing only the normal marks that would be expected after a single firing cycle. The rifle itself showed no signs of problems, and all components appeared to be functioning exactly as designed. Encouraged by the success of the first shot, they loaded 5 cartridges and repeated the test. Sarah's confidence began to return as each shot fired normally, with no mechanical problems or unusual behavior. The rifle was functioning properly, but the real challenge would be determining whether she could achieve the accuracy needed for competitive shooting after weeks of struggling with borrowed equipment. They moved to the outdoor range for more extensive testing, where Sarah could shoot at longer distances under conditions that more closely approximated actual competition. Her first few shots were scattered widely across the target, the result of weeks of poor practice with unfamiliar rifles. But, gradually, as she readjusted to her own equipment, the shots began to group more tightly. Coach Williams arrived during the afternoon testing session, having heard about the firing pin project through the local shooting community. He watched Sarah's shooting with the careful eye of someone who had trained dozens of competitive shooters, looking for signs that she was returning to her previous form. The early results were mixed, showing flashes of her former accuracy interspersed with shots that would have been unacceptable in competition. The psychological aspect of Sarah's recovery proved to be as challenging as the mechanical problems had been. Weeks of frustration and poor shooting had undermined her confidence, making her second-guess decisions that had once been automatic. She found herself overthinking every aspect of her technique, from her breathing pattern to her grip pressure, disrupting the natural rhythm that had made her such a formidable competitor. Mr. Thompson observed Sarah's struggles with the understanding of someone who had taught thousands of students to master complex skills. He recognized that technical competence was only part of the challenge. Sarah needed to rebuild the mental confidence that separated good shooters from champions. The firing pin was working perfectly, but Sarah's mind was still dealing with the trauma of her equipment failure. Elena, Marcus, and James stayed to watch Sarah shoot, invested in the success of their project beyond just the mechanical aspects. They had created a functional firing pin, but they wanted to see it help Sarah achieve her goals. As the afternoon progressed, they could see gradual improvement in her shooting, with groups of shots becoming tighter and more consistent. Coach Williams suggested that Sarah focus on rebuilding her fundamentals rather than trying to immediately return to championship-level shooting. The state competition was still 6 days away, which was barely enough time for her to regain her previous form even under ideal conditions. He recommended starting with basic exercises at short distances, gradually working back to the precision required for competitive shooting. The testing continued for 3 more days, with Sarah spending every available hour at the range. Mr. Thompson and his students monitored the firing pin's performance through hundreds of shots, documenting its condition after each session. The part continued to function flawlessly, showing normal wear patterns and no signs of the fatigue that had claimed the original firing pin. Sarah's shooting showed steady improvement as she readjusted to her familiar equipment and began to overcome the psychological effects of her recent struggles. Her shot groups became tighter and more predictable, though they were still not quite at the level she had achieved before the original failure. Coach Williams expressed cautious optimism about her chances in the upcoming competition. The local newspaper reporter, Janet Collins, returned to document the unexpected turn in Sarah's story. The narrative had evolved from a simple tale of equipment failure and dashed dreams to a more complex story about community support, creative problem-solving, and the determination to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. She interviewed the students and teacher who had made the project possible, highlighting their generosity and skill. Mr. Peterson, the gun shop owner, examined Sarah's rifle and the new firing pin during one of her practice sessions. His professional assessment was that the students had produced work that met or exceeded the quality of original equipment manufacturer parts. He expressed amazement at what had been accomplished in a high school machine shop with improvised procedures and donated materials. 3 days before the state championship, Sarah achieved her first perfect score since the original firing pin failure. The 10 shots were grouped within a space smaller than a dime, demonstrating that both her equipment and her skills were returning to championship levels. Coach Williams watched with satisfaction as his student rediscovered the confidence that had made her such a promising athlete. The success brought its own pressures, however. Sarah now had no excuses for poor performance at the state competition. Her equipment was functioning properly, and she had demonstrated that her skills remained intact. The weight of expectations from herself and from everyone who had invested time and effort in her recovery created a different kind of stress than she had experienced when her rifle was broken. Dr. Martinez, Sarah's father, watched his daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. He had seen her struggle through the darkest period of her young athletic career, and now he worried about the pressure she was placing on herself to justify everyone's faith in her abilities. The community's support had been wonderful, but it also meant that Sarah's performance at the state championship would be watched by many people who had invested emotionally in her success. The final practice session before leaving for the state championship produced mixed results. Sarah shot well overall, but not with the consistency that had characterized her performance before the original equipment failure. Coach Williams reminded her that championship shooting was as much about mental preparation as technical skill, and that her recent experiences had actually taught her valuable lessons about resilience and problem-solving. As Sarah packed her equipment for the trip to the state championship, she reflected on how much had changed in the weeks since her firing pin had broken. She had learned about metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and the generosity of people who barely knew her but were willing to help her pursue her dreams. Most importantly, she had discovered that apparent disasters could sometimes lead to unexpected opportunities and stronger relationships. The new firing pin had proven itself through hundreds of test shots, but the real test would come in the pressure-filled environment of the state championship, where Sarah would compete against the best young shooters in Texas for prizes that could determine the direction of her entire future. The Texas State Shooting Championship venue buzzed with activity as competitors from across the state arrived with their equipment and support teams. Sarah felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that always preceded major competitions, but this time the feelings were intensified by everything she had been through in the previous weeks. Her grandfather's rifle, now equipped with its handmade firing pin, felt solid and familiar in her hands as she checked it one final time. Coach Williams had driven Sarah and her parents to the championship venue 3 hours away from their hometown. The journey had been mostly quiet, with Sarah lost in thought about the challenges ahead and the weight of expectations from everyone who had helped make this moment possible. The story of her broken rifle and the community effort to repair it had spread throughout the shooting community, making her something of a celebrity among competitors and spectators. Registration and equipment inspection proceeded smoothly, with officials examining each competitor's rifle to ensure compliance with competition regulations. The inspector who checked Sarah's rifle spent extra time examining her firing pin, having heard about its unusual origin. After careful scrutiny, he pronounced it legal for competition and complimented the quality of the work, noting that it was impossible to distinguish from original manufacturer parts. Sarah's first glimpse of the competition field revealed the challenge she would face over the next 2 days. 150 of the best young shooters in Texas had gathered to compete for state titles in various categories, with college scouts and coaches watching from the sidelines. The pressure was intense, with many competitors knowing that their performance over the next 48 hours could determine their educational and athletic futures. The preliminary rounds began early Saturday morning, with competitors divided into groups based on their qualifying scores from regional competitions. Sarah found herself in the top group, competing against shooters who had been following her story and were curious to see whether she had truly recovered from her equipment problems. The format called for each competitor to fire 20 shots at long range, with scores determining advancement to Sunday's finals. Sarah's first shot of the competition was perfect, striking the target exactly where she had aimed. The familiar recoil and sound of her rifle brought back all the confidence she had built during years of training and competition. The handmade firing pin functioned flawlessly, proving that the student's careful work had created a component that could perform under championship pressure. But, as the morning progressed, Sarah began to struggle with the mental aspects of competition. The pressure of representing not just herself, but everyone who had helped her created a tension that affected her breathing and concentration. Shots that should have been routine began missing the target center by small, but significant margins. After 10 shots, she was trailing the leaders by several points, a deficit that would be difficult to overcome. Coach Williams called a timeout and took Sarah aside for a quiet conversation away from the other competitors. He reminded her that she had already achieved something remarkable just by being able to compete, and that the outcome of the championship, while important, was less significant than the journey that had brought her to this point. His words helped her refocus on the fundamentals of shooting rather than the external pressures. The second half of Saturday's competition showed marked improvement as Sarah settled into her familiar rhythm. Her shots began grouping more tightly around the target center, and her confidence returned with each successful shot. The handmade firing pin continued to perform perfectly, firing consistently with no signs of the mechanical problems that had once seemed insurmountable. By the end of Saturday's preliminary rounds, Sarah had qualified for Sunday's finals, though her position was precarious. She was tied for 8th place in a competition that would advance only the top 6 shooters to the final medal round. Her score was respectable but not dominant, reflecting the psychological challenges she had faced throughout the day. That evening, Sarah and her family had dinner with Mr. Thompson and the 3 students who had created the firing pin. Elena, Marcus, and James had driven to the championship with their teacher to watch Sarah compete, invested in seeing their project succeed on the biggest stage. Their presence was both supportive and pressure-inducing, as Sarah felt responsible for justifying their efforts and time. The conversation during dinner was light and encouraging, but Sarah could see the concern in everyone's eyes. They had all hoped that her return to competition would be more dominant, more clearly demonstrative of her abilities. Instead, she was fighting just to remain in contention for a medal, with her performance inconsistent and lacking the precision that had once made her a favorite in every competition. Dr. Martinez spoke privately with Coach Williams after dinner, expressing his worries about the pressure his daughter was feeling. The community support had been wonderful, but it had also created expectations that might be unrealistic given how little time Sarah had to prepare after getting her rifle repaired. Coach Williams assured him that Sarah was stronger than she appeared and that competition experience would serve her well in Sunday's finals. Sarah spent the evening cleaning and checking her rifle, a ritual that had always helped calm her nerves before important competitions. The handmade firing pin looked perfect after a full day of use, with no signs of wear or damage. Mr. Thompson examined it under a magnifying glass and pronounced it ready for another day of competition, expressing confidence that the part would continue to function reliably. Sleep came fitfully for Sarah that night, with dreams of missed shots and mechanical failures disturbing her rest. She woke before dawn and spent time in quiet meditation, trying to center herself for the challenges ahead. The final day of competition would determine whether months of preparation and weeks of desperate problem-solving would result in the success she had worked so hard to achieve. Sunday morning brought perfect weather conditions for shooting, with calm winds and excellent visibility. Sarah arrived at the range early for practice rounds, working to fine-tune her rifle zero and her own mental preparation. The practice shots went well, grouping tightly and building her confidence for the medal round that would begin in 2 hours. The format for Sunday's finals was elimination style, with the lowest-scoring competitor eliminated after each round of 5 shots. This meant that Sarah would need to shoot consistently well from the beginning, as falling behind early could result in elimination before she had a chance to demonstrate her capabilities. The pressure was intense, with spectators, coaches, and scouts watching every shot. Sarah's position in 8th place meant she would be among the first competitors to shoot in the final round. This could be either an advantage or disadvantage, depending on how she handled the pressure of setting the pace for other competitors. Coach Williams reminded her to focus on her own performance rather than worrying about what other shooters were doing. As Sarah prepared for her first shots of the final round, she thought about her grandfather and the rifle that had been his companion through so many challenges. She thought about Mr. Thompson and his students, who had given their time and skills to help someone they barely knew. Most of all, She thought about the lesson she had learned about persistence and community support in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. The range officer called for the first group of competitors to take their positions. Sarah stepped up to the firing line with her rifle, its handmade firing pin ready to prove itself in the most important competition of her young career. The next few hours would determine whether her story would end in triumph or disappointment. But, regardless of the outcome, she had already achieved something remarkable simply by being able to compete. The first shot of the medal round was moments away, and Sarah felt a calm determination settle over her as she prepared to fire. Everything that had happened in the previous weeks had led to this moment, and she was ready to give her best effort regardless of the results. The range fell silent as Sarah took her position at the firing line, her grandfather's rifle steady in her practiced hands. The handmade firing pin that had seemed like an impossible dream just weeks ago was now about to be tested under the ultimate pressure of championship competition. 8 other competitors stood alongside her, each representing years of training and preparation, but Sarah felt a unique calm settle over her as she prepared for the first shot of the medal round. Her breathing fell into the rhythm that had been trained into her through thousands of hours of practice. Inhale, exhale, hold, squeeze. The rifle fired with its familiar crack, and the target downrange showed a perfect center hit. The handmade firing pin had functioned flawlessly under pressure, just as Mr. Thompson and his students had promised it would. Sarah felt her confidence surge as muscle memory and mechanical precision combined to produce exactly the results she needed. The second shot followed the same pattern: perfect breath control, steady aim, smooth trigger squeeze, and another center hit. Sarah was shooting with a precision that had made her a regional champion, but, more importantly, she was shooting with the relaxed confidence that separated good competitors from champions. The weeks of struggle and uncertainty had taught her to appreciate every successful shot, making her more focused rather than taking her abilities for granted. By the 5th shot of the first series, Sarah had posted a perfect score, while 2 other competitors had been eliminated for lower scores. Coach Williams watched from the sidelines with growing excitement, recognizing the signs that his student was entering the zone where exceptional performances became possible. The rifle was performing flawlessly, and Sarah was shooting with better concentration than she had shown in months. The second series of 5 shots proved even better, with Sarah's bullets grouping so tightly that they could be covered by a quarter. The range officials began to take special notice of her performance, recognizing that they might be witnessing something extraordinary. Word spread among the spectators that the girl with the rebuilt rifle was shooting lights out, and more people began gathering around her section of the range. Elena, Marcus, and James watched with growing amazement as their handmade firing pin enabled performance that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The part they had created in a high school machine shop was functioning as well as any original manufacturer component, proving that careful engineering and skilled craftsmanship could produce results that rivaled professional manufacturing. Their pride in the technical achievement was matched only by their excitement at seeing Sarah succeed. The third series of shots eliminated 2 more competitors, leaving Sarah in a group of 4 shooters competing for the final medals. Her position had improved from 8th place to 2nd, and she was now trailing the leader by only 1 point. More importantly, she was shooting with consistent precision that suggested she could sustain this level of performance through the remaining series. Mr. Thompson found himself holding his breath as each shot was fired, not because he doubted the quality of the firing pin his students had created, but because he understood how much this moment meant to Sarah and everyone who had supported her journey. The technical success of their project was already proven. Now they were witnessing the human triumph that made all their efforts worthwhile. Sarah's parents watched from the spectator area with emotions that mixed pride, anxiety, and amazement. They had seen their daughter struggle through the darkest period of her athletic career, questioning whether she would ever compete again. Now she was shooting better than ever, demonstrating resilience and determination that went far beyond her technical skills as a marksman. The 4th series proved to be the turning point of the competition. Sarah's 5 shots formed a group so tight that the range officials had to use precision measuring instruments to verify the individual bullet holes. Her score was perfect, while the previous leader faltered under pressure and dropped points that would prove impossible to recover. With 1 series remaining, Sarah had taken a commanding lead in the competition. The pressure of leading the state championship with only 5 shots remaining might have overwhelmed a less experienced competitor, but Sarah found herself completely calm and focused. The struggles of the previous weeks had taught her perspective about what truly mattered, and she approached these final shots with the confidence of someone who had already overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The fifth and final series began with Sarah holding a 3-point lead over her closest competitor. A perfect series would guarantee her the state championship, while even a small mistake could allow others to close the gap. Coach Williams reminded her to shoot her own shots and not worry about what other competitors were doing, advice that proved prescient as pressure began to affect the other finalists. Sarah's first shot of the final series was perfect, striking the center of the target with precision that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. The handmade firing pin continued to perform flawlessly, firing with consistency that would have impressed the original rifle manufacturer. The second shot was equally precise, maintaining her lead and building confidence for the remaining shots. The third shot of the series produced something unexpected, a score that was better than perfect according to the precision measurement system used in championship competition. The bullet had struck so close to the theoretical center of the target that officials had to use electronic measuring equipment to verify the result. Sarah was not just winning. She was shooting at a level that approached the theoretical limits of the equipment and range conditions. Shot 4 continued the pattern of extraordinary precision, with Sarah's bullet striking within millimeters of the exact target center. The crowd had grown quiet, recognizing that they were witnessing a performance that might be remembered in state championship history. Even competing shooters stopped to watch, understanding that they were seeing something special. The final shot of the competition carried enormous weight, as it would determine not just the state championship, but also set Sarah's final score for the entire competition. A perfect shot would give her a score that could potentially break state championship records, while anything less would still likely secure the title but miss the opportunity for a historic performance. Sarah's preparation for the final shot followed the same ritual that had served her throughout the competition: controlled breathing, careful sight alignment, and gradual trigger pressure that built to the moment of firing. The rifle fired with the same reliable crack it had produced throughout the competition, and the target downrange showed another perfect center hit. The official announcement confirmed what everyone had suspected. Sarah Martinez had not only won the state championship, but had set a new state record for precision in her division. Her final score represented shooting that was virtually perfect, with her rifle's handmade firing pin enabling performance that exceeded even her previous personal bests. The celebration that followed was emotional for everyone involved in Sarah's journey. Mr. Thompson and his students were congratulated repeatedly for their role in making the achievement possible, with shooting officials expressing amazement at the quality of work that had been accomplished in a high school machine shop. The firing pin had not just functioned, it had enabled record-setting performance. College scouts who had written off Sarah's chances weeks earlier were now competing to offer her scholarships, recognizing that her recent performance demonstrated not just technical skill, but also the mental toughness and problem-solving ability that would serve her well in collegiate competition. Her story of overcoming equipment failure through community support and innovative thinking made her an attractive recruit beyond just her shooting scores. Janet Collins, the newspaper reporter who had been following Sarah's story, found herself documenting a triumph that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The narrative had evolved from a simple sports story to something more profound about community, perseverance, and the power of people working together to solve problems that seemed impossible. The awards ceremony that evening was particularly meaningful for Sarah, as she accepted her state championship trophy and record-setting certificate while her grandfather's rebuilt rifle stood beside her. The handmade firing pin had not just saved her competitive season, it had enabled her to achieve the greatest success of her career. Mr. Peterson, the gun shop owner who had originally delivered the disappointing news about replacement part costs, presented Sarah with a plaque commemorating her achievement. He noted that in 40 years of business, he had never seen a more impressive demonstration of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable. As Sarah looked out at the crowd of people who had supported her journey, she reflected on how much her understanding of success had changed. The state championship and record-setting performance were wonderful, but they were made possible by the generosity, skill, and determination of people who had believed in her when she had nearly given up on herself. The handmade firing pin that had made it all possible would remain in her grandfather's rifle, a permanent reminder that apparent disasters can sometimes lead to achievements that would never have been possible otherwise. Sarah Martinez had indeed stopped her opponents, but, more importantly, she had learned that with the right support and determination, seemingly broken dreams could be repaired and made stronger than ever before. Her final count of 324 consecutive successful shots throughout the championship weekend, including practice and competition rounds, represented not just technical precision, but a triumph of human ingenuity and community spirit that would be remembered long after the record books were updated.